Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to From the Vault, the podcast brought to you by the South Carolina Historical Society. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the Society. In today's episode, we're talking about two women who were close enough to Loyalists that the Patriot powers of the state were concerned. Sarah Stuart was married to John Stuart, who was Great Britain's Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Southern District. When the war begins, John flees to St. Augustine after being accused of plotting to arm Native Americans against the Patriots, and Sarah ends up being imprisoned in her home because of her ties to John and the Crown. Elizabeth Simpson is a woman from the Camden district of South Carolina, probably less wealthy than Sarah because of ties between her husband, who was named John Simpson, and the royal governor, Lord William Campbell. She gives an affidavit testifying to a potential plot and is called before the Council of Safety to explain it. But before we get to their stories, let's hear some announcements. Our Tracing Time event was so popular that we're taking it on the road. Join us in Aiken on May 3rd for a free program with authors Dr. Walter Curry Jr. and Margaret Seidler exploring the intertwined histories of slavery from the perspective of descendants of the enslaved people and the descendants of enslavers and traders. You can register for that on our website, schistory.org. And don't miss our weekly architectural tours hosted by our education coordinator, Melina Teston, every Friday at 2 p.m. in our fireproof building at 100 Meeting Street in Charleston. To learn more about the tour or to reserve your spot, check out the event at our Programs and Events page on our website. For this episode, we'll start with Sarah and then we'll discuss Elizabeth. There are a lot of sources that discuss Sarah and John Stuart and far fewer for Elizabeth and John Simpson, which makes me think that these two women were of different levels in society and may not have known each other, but they were connected through America's fight for independence. For this episode, the sources we used are Barnett Elliott's 4th Regiment Order Book, housed in our archives, many documents from the Henry Lawrence papers housed in our archives, the South Carolina Encyclopedia, NCpedia, letters of John Stuart, accessed through the Northern Illinois University Digital Library, Memoirs of the American Revolution by William Moultrie, an article from the South Carolina Historical Magazine titled The Present Defenseless State of the Country, Gunpowder Plots in Revolutionary South Carolina, the James Grant of Ballindock papers, housed at the National Archives of Scotland, petition papers of Sarah Stuart and Christiana Fenwick, accessed through RevWarApps.com and Ancestry.com. While the story that I want to highlight here is Sarah's, we do have to tell some of her husband John's story to put her life into context. John became the superintendent of the Indian Department in 1761. He was originally born in Scotland and served in the Royal Navy in the 1740s and then moved to North America and eventually settled in South Carolina. He served many roles in public service, like fire master and tax assessor, and spent some time in the militia during the French and Indian War at Fort Loudon in Tennessee, which was surrounded by villages of the Overhill Cherokees. He escaped when that fort fell to the Cherokees in 1760, and he returned to Charleston. And while he held all those jobs at different points in time that I mentioned a moment ago, he was also a really social guy. He was a member of many organizations here in Charleston and was someone that everybody in town just kind of knew and had spent some time with. And the American Revolution really comes in earnest to South Carolina in 1775. By June of that year, a group of leading men in the colony have formed the Council of Safety, and part of their job is to set up the state's armed forces. That same summer, depending on who you ask, John either chose the side of Great Britain or was forced to escape Charleston because he was falsely accused of acting in service to Parliament. And there was already some animosity between John and some of South Carolina's leading men. Before he had his role as superintendent of the Indian Department for the Southern District, the governors of each state usually handled relations with Native Americans. And after he took that job, they still wanted some control over that, and Stuart didn't want them to have that control. In 1764, the governors received money from the royal government for presents and entertainment for Native Americans. Now, these gifts were used to gain or keep support of Native tribes. Stuart wanted all money related to anything involving Native Americans to go through him, and wrote to General Thomas Gage, the British commander-in-chief, about that. So that remained a point of contention. He also very publicly did not get along with William Henry Drayton, who was one of the men in that Council of Safety. He was one of the most prominent men in the state, and he really helped set up South Carolina's government. Once that Council of Safety formed in June 1775, John was almost immediately accused of trying to gather Native Americans to fight for the British. And this accusation is what caused him to escape first to his plantation on Ladies Island in Beaufort, and then going on to St. Augustine in Florida, which was controlled by the British at the time. And that feud with William Henry Drayton comes back around to all of this because John believed it was William Henry Drayton who was behind the accusation of his collusion with the Native Americans, that accusation coming from the Council of Safety. In an article about John, author Philip G. Swan writes that John Stuart gave muskets to some of the members of the Catawba in May of 1775, perhaps continuing the practice of gifting started well before the Revolution. Later that month, the South Carolina Gazette reports that the British government had given, quote, 78,000 guns and bayonets to be sent to America to put into the hands of Negroes, the Roman Catholics, the Indians, and the Canadians, end quote. While this accusation may not have been accurate, it tied together the fears of the Americans in South Carolina, namely that the Native Americans and the Black people in the state were going to rise up in favor of the British against the Patriots. However, John maintained his innocence, and he wrote to the Council of Safety from St. Augustine, asserting that he was being accused without evidence. In one letter, Stuart writes that, quote, I have never received any orders from my superiors which, by the most tortured construction, could be interpreted to spirit up or employ the Indians to fall upon the frontier inhabitants or to take any part in the dispute between Great Britain and her colonies. And I do not know that any part of my conduct, through all the various scenes of my life, can fix upon me the imputation of cruelty or inhumanity, or induce a belief that I could wantonly use any influence with Indians to fall upon innocent people, end quote. By the end of the year, however, from St. Augustine, John was telling royal agents that dealt with Native Americans to arrest Patriot agents whenever possible. So even if he was not working against the Patriot cause when he was in South Carolina, at some point during his time in Florida, he was. Because John was gone, Sarah Stuart, his wife, and their daughter were considered flight risks, and South Carolina's leaders wanted to keep them there, perhaps to give John a reason to return and be tried for his alleged crimes. In February of 1776, a few months after John's escape, there is an order in the 4th Regiment's order book that Sarah and her daughter Christiana Fenwick quote, be restrained from absenting themselves from his house in Charlestown. Now, 2 days later, Christiana's husband, Edward Fenwick, is allowed to take her to the country, according to the order book, if he promises to be responsible that she not escape. It seems like Sarah stays at the house in town, but later in February, she is allowed, quote, necessary air and exercise upon the terms proposed in Dr. Chalmers' letter. That is to be accompanied by Mr. Fenwick or the doctor, and they being responsible for her appearance whenever called for, end quote. So the house where Sarah was kept, the house that she and John lived in before he escaped to Florida, it still stands today. It's at 106 Trad Street in downtown Charleston, and it's known as the Colonel John Stuart House. So you can go see that and see where she was kept. We don't really know what Sarah's life was like day to day when she was being imprisoned in her house. The closest we get to an account of her days is from a letter to her husband and from her attempts to claim her husband's pension from his service to the king before and during the American Revolution. The letter happens while she's being imprisoned, but those pension claims are well after the war, just to give you an idea of the time frame. Her letter to John was written February 14th, 1776, and is held in the James Grant Papers at the National Archives of Scotland. In it, she writes, quote, I am a state prisoner in my own house. There is a 12-man guard. They permit my daughter, Mrs. Fenwick, to be with me. Dr. Chalmers, Mr. Rose, and Mrs. Oliphant have been permitted to call. One of your letters to General Grant saying that the Indians are to be brought in has been intercepted, end quote. While we don't get a lot of emotion from Sarah, we do see some of the correspondence that the South Carolina government has seized that led to their belief in John's guilt. So we get some insight into his case there. And we get to hear from Sarah, who explains her situation. Now, Sarah does not spend the entirety of the war trapped inside her home. We do know that she eventually escaped to St. Augustine, and John eventually dies in Florida in 1779. I haven't been able to nail down an exact timeline of her escape in relation to his death. At some point, he did go to Pensacola and wasn't in St. Augustine anymore, so I'm not sure if they ever got to see each other again before he died. By 1782, right around when the Patriots take back control of Charleston, Sarah has returned to England. While she's there in England, she does file those claims for a post-war pension from the British government because that's who her husband and her son, it turns out, was fighting for. In her first claim, which was in 1783, she writes that after her husband escaped to St. Augustine and the Americans were unable to punish him, they took to persecuting his family. She writes, quote, the many personal indignities that your memorialist received at this period, her close confinement under a guard for upwards of 8 months, with threats of violence, even of death itself, and the hazardous escape to Augustine are among the circumstances that are very well known and can be sufficiently testified by every loyalist from that province, end quote. And after she applied for that pension, she was initially awarded about £80 a year. And her daughter, Christiana, also received a pension from the British government. She was back in England at this time, too. Hers was more than her mother's, which helped because Christiana was raising 3 children at the time. In 1786, 3 years after her first petition for a pension, Sarah wrote again, asking for an increase in what she received. Now, by this point, her daughter, Christiana, had died. And Sarah was raising Christiana's children, so she needed more money to live on. In this petition, she writes, quote, your memorialist and her late daughter, Christiana Fenwick, were confined as hostages in Charlestown during a space of nearly 2 years, daily mortified by being obliged to witness the destruction of their fortune and treated with many disrespectful indignities from which their sex and the humanity of a civilized people ought to have protected them, and which only terminated by your memorialist effecting a most difficult and hazardous escape to St. Augustine, end quote. So you may notice the difference in the times there. In her first petition, she writes that she was imprisoned in her house for upwards of 8 months. And in the second one, She says that both she and her daughter were confined to the house for nearly 2 years. So a little discrepancy there, but the details that she describes sound pretty harrowing. Before Christiana's death, she too wrote to the British government in September of 1782 requesting money for her husband's service. He was still in America and was recuperating from injuries suffered during the war. In that petition, she wrote that her husband, Edward Fenwick's property, had been taken by the, quote, rebels, as she called them, and that he was, quote, at the commencement of the American Rebellion, from his attachment to your majesty, lodged in the common jail of Charlestown in South Carolina, where your memorialist also remained for a considerable time, end quote. So it sounds like both she and her husband might have spent some time in a regular jail, not imprisoned in one of their homes. Even with all of these firsthand accounts from Sarah and Christiana, we don't know how they felt about the war. Both of their husbands eventually worked with the British, though John denied he was at first, and Edward later apologized to the American government in order to get his property back. Both women seem to have suffered for their husbands' beliefs. They were imprisoned, and they had much less power to affect their circumstances than the men who put them in that situation. So while they may have been loyalists, they may not have been. They never state their beliefs outright, though they do write to the British government for help based on the service of their husbands. And much like Sarah and Christiana, we don't know which side Elizabeth Simpson fell on during the war. But unlike Sarah, there is far less information about Elizabeth and her husband, probably because they were less wealthy and held less social status. We do know that Elizabeth Simpson was a woman who lived in the Camden district of South Carolina during the American Revolution, and she claims that her husband was a relative of the royal governor, Lord William Campbell. We do have some of her own words in the form of a July 1775 sworn statement to Peter Boonthau, who was the Justice of the Peace in South Carolina at the time. That statement that she gave to him was then sent to the Council of Safety, and both she and her husband, John Simpson, were asked to appear for questioning. Now, in her statement, she reported that she and her husband met with Lord William Campbell when he first arrived in South Carolina, and she heard the conversation between the two men. So 2 things that we want to talk about here. Just a brief reminder, Lord William Campbell was the last royal governor of South Carolina. He came in during the summer of 1775. He did not serve on his term long, because by the fall of that year, due to the tensions in the state at the time, he escaped. He got out of Charleston on a ship called the Tamar. That was a British ship, obviously. He didn't spend long in the state, but he was the last royal governor. And the feelings were at the time that he was stirring up Loyalist sympathies in the state. And the other part of this that I want to point out is that in her statement, Sarah says that she heard the conversation between the two men. She interestingly does not say that she participated in it, although, as you'll see in her statement, she is mentioned in the plan that she reports, but I thought her choice of words was worth pointing out. Her statement says that Governor Campbell asked John, her husband, how feelings were in the back country of the colony, so basically everywhere northwest of Charleston. And John replies that Colonel Fletchall had 1,000 men ready to fight for the king, and that a visit from the governor could lead to more. Now, according to Elizabeth, Governor Campbell also said that the Attorney General, James Simpson, was secretly on the side of the crown, though he had not declared so to the Council of Safety because they liked him. Earlier in the year, William Henry Drayton, Thomas Corbett, and John Newfill had intercepted a ship with mail in the Charleston harbor and stolen the correspondence meant for the royal governors. This was to get information about what they were planning against the colonists. In her statement, Elizabeth reports that Governor Campbell claimed that the men who took the mail were, quote, hot-headed fools that would soon be put to death, end quote. And according to her, Governor Campbell also asked John, since he was dressed in a, quote, plain and poor way, end quote, to travel around the backcountry and listen to what people were saying so that he could report back to the governor, as well as go to certain people and gather their help in enlisting men in service to the king so that they might have an army in readiness when he sent for them. And this is the part where Elizabeth was mentioned too, because Campbell, as Elizabeth reports it, asked that John and Elizabeth go to the backcountry for this purpose. The next part of Elizabeth's testimony mentions a plot that is very similar to one that later led to the death of a free black man. We don't know if this is part of the same chain of events, but the similarities and the timeline match up. She reported that Governor Campbell expected a ship soon, a British ship, and that a black ship pilot was expected to guide them into the harbor. Her report goes on to say that Governor Campbell, quote, had a feeling for the committee were so headstrong that they would not yield to the king but would ruin the country, and therefore there would be a river of blood spilt, end quote. Now, just a few weeks later, after this report, a free black harbor pilot named Thomas Jeremiah was hanged after he was accused in an alleged plot by the British to use enslaved African Americans to attack Patriots. Now, this goes all the way back to some of those fears that John Stuart stoked of arming Native Americans and black people against the Patriots. Rumors of the plot had begun swirling before Elizabeth's statement, but it's interesting that she mentions Thomas Jeremiah's specific job and race in relation to an alleged British plot. It was a very fraught time. People were paranoid. Everything was up in the air. And to read the letters and even the meeting minutes from the Council of Safety, you get that tension. Now, Elizabeth could not sign her name to the document and signed with an X, as was customary for those who couldn't write. And that inability gives us a clue as to her social or financial standing. Her statement was sent to the Council of Safety, and they reported in their meeting minutes that Elizabeth and John appeared before them for questioning about Elizabeth's affidavit. But those meeting notes don't say anything about their responses or if anything happened to them after that questioning. A few days later, however, Henry Lawrence does write to Colonel Thomas Fletchall, who lives in the Camden district, and he was the man named in Elizabeth's statement who had a group of 1,000 men ready to fight against the Patriots. Now, in the letter that Henry writes to Thomas Fletchall, he says that they gathered intelligence that he was, quote, not a friend to the cause of liberty, and Henry specifically asks him to declare his loyalty to America. As I mentioned, this was an incredibly fraught time here in South Carolina. There were instances of men being tarred and feathered and carted through town after being found to be Loyalists. Mail was being intercepted and read by members of the Council of Safety. An oath known as the Association was starting to be taken by those who believed in the American cause, and it could be disaster for someone who refused to take the oath. Here with Sarah and Elizabeth, we have examples of two women, three, if you count Sarah's daughter, Christiana, who were navigating these systems that were just now forming and often changing. Their stories give us a glimpse at what life was like during this time, for people of means and for those who may not have had as much. So that's going to do it for this month's episode, but we'll see you back here on the second Monday of May with a new episode focusing on the 4th Regiment's order book and what they're up to during the fall of 1776. We'll see you soon.